The air reaches you first, warm and green and heavy with something just beginning to turn. You are in a meadow where the light comes through in long golden columns, and beneath your feet the grass is soft, almost giving way. Somewhere nearby, petals are falling from flowers you cannot name. The world here feels full, held at the peak of itself, quietly waiting. The voices you hear are distant, laughing, low. There are young women moving through the tall grass ahead of you, their arms full of blossoms, white, violet, gold. They move without hurry. The air smells of clover and warm soil, and something faintly sweet beneath both of those things, a root smell. The smell of the earth holding itself together beneath the surface. You do not know it yet. But this is the last morning the world will look exactly like this. The young woman at the center of the meadow has crouched low to look at something in the grass. She is younger seeming than the others, though she is not young in the way mortals are young. Her hair is loose. Her hands are steady. Her name is Persephone. She does not yet know what the day will ask of her. The accounts that have come down to us are not complete. They never are when the event is old enough. What remains is this: a meadow, a flower, a sound that travelled all the way to the peaks of distant mountains. What was felt in that place? What passed through the mind of the goddess who knelt in the grass and reached for something beautiful? That part is harder to recover, but scholars have tried. Poets have tried. The evidence of stone and hymn and ritual suggests, at minimum, that the world before the abduction was a world in which Persephone and the earth were not yet separate things. She was known then as Kor, the Maiden. That designation appears in the oldest inscriptions, scratched into votive tablets at shrines across the Greek world. Kor, just that. As though the word itself was sufficient. As though maidenhood was a force too fundamental to require further naming. In the theological traditions preserved in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which scholars date to roughly the 7th or 6th century before the Common Era, Kor is described as the daughter of Demeter and Zeus. Her mother governed the grain, her father governed the sky. Between them they held the growing world in place, and Kor, their daughter, moved through it without impediment, gathering the things the earth offered freely: roses, crocuses, violets, hyacinths, irises. The hymn catalogues them as though they matter. They do matter. A flower appears in nearly every version of this story, and in the oldest versions. The flower is a trap. On this morning, and all accounts agree it is morning, with the light still coming sideways and the dew not yet gone, Persephone moves through the Nysian plain with the daughters of Oceanus for company. Their names survive in fragments: Leucippe, Phano, Electra, Ianthe. They are listed in the hymn with the care of someone who wanted the reader to understand that this was a real event, not a symbol, not an abstraction. Real women, real flowers, real grass beneath their feet. Persephone is not troubled. That much the sources agree on. She is absorbed. The world around her is abundant and unhurried, and she moves through it as someone who has never had reason to move otherwise. She knows the flowers by touch. She knows which stems yield easily and which resist. Her hands carry the scent of petals and soil simultaneously, the upper and lower of things, the bloom and its root. Demeter is not present in the meadow. That absence would matter later, though the hymn does not dwell on it. The goddess of grain and harvest is elsewhere, attending to the work of the earth in the way that required her constant presence. She and her daughter had never been far from each other before. The Rarian plain, which later accounts identify as the site of their reunion, suggests how close their domains had always been. Grain and flower. Growth above and growth below. A mother who fed the world, and a daughter who moved through the world the mother fed. The narcissus is mentioned in almost every surviving account. It grows apart from the other flowers, and it is extraordinary. 100 blooms from a single root by some accounts. Its fragrance extends upward into the sky and downward into the roots of the world. The hymn says Zeus caused it to bloom there as an enticement. Whether that detail reflects theological conviction or later interpretation is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is that Persephone sees it. She moves toward it the way one moves toward something that seems, for a moment, to have been placed there specifically for you. The grass bends where she steps. Her companions are still laughing somewhere behind her. The sound of them is warm and ordinary. It is the kind of morning that does not announce itself. Nothing in it says, "Pay attention." Nothing in it says, "Remember this." She crouches. She reaches. The narcissus is rooted deeper than it should be. She can feel the resistance in it, faint but present, as though the stem knows something, as though the ground beneath it is not simply ground. The other flowers in her arms are already beginning to close slightly in the warmth. There is soil under her fingernails from where she has been working in the earth all morning. The smell of it is rich and dark and familiar, the smell of something that has been there a long time, holding still beneath everything visible. She does not let go of the narcissus. The world of the meadow, as it stands in this moment, is the world the Eleusinian mysteries would spend centuries trying to preserve in ritual form. The initiates who gathered at Eleusis each year in the time of the classical Greeks were not simply honoring a myth. They were trying to remember what this meadow felt like before the ground moved. They were trying to hold, for one night of torchlight and silence, the texture of a morning that ended. Persephone's fingers close around the stem. Above her, the light continues to come through in its long golden columns. Beneath her, deeper than any root she has ever held, something begins to shift. The narcissus stem held. Persephone's fingers tightened around it, and the ground beneath her knees gave a faint, low tremor, not violent, not loud, but unmistakable, like something answering from far below. If these stories have become part of your nights, a quiet subscribe helps them reach others who need them too. The grass around her was still wet with dew. What followed is reconstructed from multiple ancient sources, none of them written by anyone who was present. The Homeric hymn provides the most detailed account. Later versions, Ovid, Claudian, the fragments preserved in the scholiasts, add texture, occasionally contradict each other on minor points, and agree entirely on the essential shape of what happened next. The earth opened. The sources are consistent on this. The plain did not tremble gradually. It did not give warning. The ground split in a long fissure that the hymn describes as sudden and complete, beginning at the place where the narcissus root met the soil and extending outward in both directions. The sound of it is not described directly in the oldest texts. Claudian, writing much later, offers the detail of tremendous noise, a tearing subterranean crack that sent birds from the grasses in every direction. Whether that detail belongs to the oldest tradition or represents later elaboration is not entirely clear. What is not disputed is the chariot. Hades came up from below. His horses were dark. The hymn calls them immortal. They moved through the gap in the earth and out into the morning light with the particular steadiness of animals accustomed to moving in places where there is no light at all. Hades himself, the sources describe with relative brevity in this moment. There is no extended physical description in the hymn. He is present, he is decisive. He sees Persephone and takes her. The flowers she had gathered fell. Leucippe heard her first. That detail is not in the hymn. It is an inference drawn from the geography of the account, from the way the hymn describes the companions as still at a distance when the ground moved. Phino, Electra, Ianthe, they would have turned at the sound. They would have seen the gap in the earth, the dark horses, the chariot already moving. The hymn records that Persephone cried out. Her voice, the text says, reached the peaks of mountains and the depths of the sea. That is a theological statement as much as a narrative one. It is the ancient poet's way of conveying scale. The cry of a goddess is not a sound that stays in one place. It propagates. No one came. The companions could not follow into a gap in the earth. They were daughters of Oceanus, nymphs of the upper world, with no authority over what lay below. The hymn does not record what they did in the moments immediately after. Later sources suggest they were transformed by Demeter's grief or by Persephone's own anguish into birds or into the sirens. Those accounts belong to a different tradition and are not universally accepted. What the oldest sources establish is simpler. The companions remained in the meadow and Persephone did not. The narcissus stayed behind. Its 100 blooms, still open, still releasing their fragrance into the morning air. The fissure in the earth closed. The grass moved slightly in a faint wind that had not been there before. The sky remained unchanged. The sun continued in its arc. Only one divine figure is recorded as having witnessed what happened. Hecate, who dwelt in her cave. The sources locate this cave near the plain, though the precise geography varies, heard the cry. The hymn is careful on this point. Hecate heard, she did not see. She would tell Demeter later, when Demeter's search finally brought her close, that she had been present for the sound but not the sight. She had no name to offer. She had only the direction from which the voice had come and the fact of the cry itself. That distinction, hearing without seeing, is one the hymn seems to treat as significant. Hecate stands at crossroads. She occupies thresholds. She is present at transitions between states. That she heard Persephone's cry and could not identify its source places her, from the first moment, in a position of partial knowledge. She would become something to Persephone later, a companion in the underworld. The one who had listened from the dark before the dark became familiar. Whether that relationship was already implied in the myth's earliest layers or developed through later tradition, scholars continue to discuss. The evidence does not resolve it cleanly. Below the plain, in the passage downward, the air changed. The warmth of the meadow did not follow. The smell of petals and clover did not follow. What followed Persephone into the dark was only what she herself carried, the soil on her hands, the stems of flowers crushed in the speed of the chariot's movement, the scent of the narcissus still on her fingers. As surfaces, those residues of the upper world. The hymn does not dwell on what Persephone felt in this descent. The text records her crying out. It records Hades driving his chariot through the dark at great speed. It records her name, not Kore, not the Maiden, but Persephone, used in a context that suggests transformation already in progress. Whether the name change is meant to mark the moment of her passage into the underworld, or simply reflects the hymn's convention of using both names interchangeably, is a question the text itself does not answer. What the text does answer is this: the plain above was silent. The flowers lay where they had fallen. The companions were still. Above them, the morning light continued to come through in its long columns, reaching down to where the grass was bent and the soil was disturbed, and nothing remained to indicate what had been there except the open narcissus and its roots. Deeper than they should have been, still holding in the earth, Demeter would not know for 9 days. In all that time, the meadow would hold the shape of the morning, as though waiting for Persephone to return to it, to reach again for the flower she had left unfinished, to pick up the blossoms scattered in the grass. The river that runs through the deepest part of the underworld, the Lethe, whose waters carried the property of dissolving what the dead had been, was still far below. Persephone had not reached it. She had not been asked to drink. That would not be asked of her. But the river was there, somewhere beneath the chariot's path, running in the dark with its slow, erasing pull, indifferent to whether those who passed above it were gods or shades, or something in the process of becoming neither. The ground above the Nysian plain did not tremble again. It settled. The morning held its warmth. A single white blossom from the gathering, an iris, by the accounting of the flowers Persephone carried, lay in the grass where she had been kneeling. Its stem broken cleanly near the base, its petals still open to the light. Demeter did not know immediately. The hymn is plain on this point. She was elsewhere when it happened. The sources do not specify where. Some scholiasts have suggested she was tending to the grain fields in the regions she favoured, Eleusis or the Rarian plain, or one of the coastal territories where her agricultural authority was most concentrated. Others propose she had been present at the meadow earlier that morning and had withdrawn before the narcissus bloomed. Neither account can be verified. What the hymn establishes, without ambiguity, is the interval, 9 days. 9 nights. That is the duration of her search before she received anything resembling an answer. She began looking almost at once. The text implies she sensed the absence quickly, though the mechanism of that sensing is not described. Mothers in the hymns perceive such things through means the poems do not explain. She called out. She lit torches. The Homeric hymn presents her moving across the surface of the world at great speed, holding a torch in each hand, moving through the dark when the sun went down, and continuing when it rose again. She did not eat. She did not bathe. She did not rest. These details, the torches, the fasting, the sleeplessness, appear consistently across the oldest sources. They suggest a figure in acute and unmanaged grief. They also, as later commentators have noted, carry the structure of ritual. The search for Persephone, as the hymn describes it, maps closely onto certain practices associated with the Eleusinian mysteries. Whether the ritual imitated the myth, or the myth was constructed to explain the ritual, is a question the ancient sources themselves debated. No resolution was reached. The world through which Demeter moved was still intact. The grain had not yet failed. The trees still held their leaves. The animals still grazed in ordinary meadows. This is an important detail. The famine came later as a deliberate act, a withdrawal of divine attention rather than an accidental consequence of grief. In these first 9 days, the earth continued as it had been. Only one thing was missing from it. Demeter asked everyone she passed. The hymn records this. She asked mortals she encountered on roads and at river crossings. She asked the nymphs of forests and springs. She asked divine figures whose domains touched the surface of the earth. None of them could tell her what she needed to know. Either they had not witnessed the abduction, or they were unwilling to speak of it. The hymn does not distinguish clearly between these possibilities. The silence of the gods in those 9 days is treated by the text as a fact without a provided explanation. Hecate she found on the 9th day, or near it. The sources vary on the precise timing. Hecate had been waiting. The hymn presents her coming forward to meet Demeter with a torch of her own, an image that appears frequently in later iconography, the 2 goddesses converging in the dark, each carrying light. Hecate told Demeter what she knew. She had heard the cry. She had been in her cave, which stood near the plain, near enough to hear the sound carry. The voice was Persephone's. The direction had been downward. She had no name to give. She could not say who had taken the maiden or by what means. She knew only what the cry had carried to her and what it had meant. A threshold had been crossed. Something that had been above had gone below. She could not say more than that. Demeter's response to this account is not described in granular detail by the hymn. The text registers her continuing distress. It notes that Hecate offered to accompany her, and that this offer was accepted. The 2 goddesses moved together after that point, Hecate walking beside Demeter as a witness rather than a guide, since she possessed no more information than she had already provided. What Demeter required was not a companion in grief. What she required was a witness, someone who had been present for any portion of what had happened. Hecate could provide only the sound of it. For the full account, Demeter would need to approach Helios, whose chariot crossed the sky from east to west each day without interruption. Nothing that occurred on the surface of the earth escaped his observation. Nothing that occurred at its surface in daylight. In the morning, when the sun had already risen above the plain, whether Demeter understood this immediately or came to it through exhaustion of other options, the sources do not specify. The hymn narrates her approach to Helios as a decision made at some point during or after the 9th day. The precise sequence of events in these 9 days has been a subject of scholarly reconstruction for centuries, and no version satisfies all the textual evidence simultaneously. What is clear is the situation Demeter faced at the close of this interval. 9 days had passed. She had moved across the entire surface of the known world, or what the hymn presents as its entirety. She had questioned everyone within reach. She had received from Hecate a partial account, sound without sight, direction without identity. The earth around her was still producing grain, still warm, still carrying the scent of autumn harvest, moving slowly toward its end, but none of that abundance registered against the single absence it could not resolve. Persephone was below. Demeter did not yet know this in confirmed terms. She would know it soon. Helios would tell her. He would tell her everything, including the name of who had done this and the authority that had sanctioned it. That revelation would come. The hymn builds toward it deliberately. But in these 9 days before that conversation, Demeter carried only the weight of not knowing. She moved through an ordinary world that had continued as though nothing had changed. The crops stood in their rows. The earth held its warmth. The rivers ran at their usual depths. Nothing in the visible landscape confirmed what she understood in the part of herself that was older than observation. That the world had a gap in it now. That something was missing from it that could not be recovered by searching its surface. She held her torches through the dark hours. She walked without stopping. The ground was solid under her feet. The sky above her was unchanged. Somewhere far below, out of reach of her torches and beyond the range of her authority, Persephone rode in a chariot through the dark, still carrying the soil of the meadow on her hands. Still faintly scented with the narcissus she had not finished gathering. The broken iris lay in the Nysian grass, its petals beginning, slowly, to close. Helios presented a particular problem for any scholar attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events. He was not a god, one simply approached. His chariot rose each morning from the eastern waters and drove its course across the full breadth of the sky before descending again into the ocean beyond the western horizon. He did not pause. He did not step down from his position to speak with those who walked below. To reach him required either waiting for him or calling upward, and the hymn is careful to describe Demeter's approach as a formal act of supplication, not an accidental encounter. The text places this meeting after the 9 days, or within them near their close. The scholarship, as has been noted, cannot resolve the timing precisely. What the hymn records is the appeal itself. Demeter stood before Helios. She addressed him as the one who sees all things, whose chariot covers the earth from its eastern edge to its western boundary each day without exception. She asked him to tell her what he had witnessed. He did. The account that Helios gave is one of the most consequential passages in the hymn, and one of the most compressed. He does not offer embellishment. He does not express sympathy in explicit terms, though the hymn notes that he is moved by her grief. He tells her the facts as he observed them from his chariot on the morning the plain split open. He names the one who took Persephone. He names the one who permitted it. Hades and Zeus. Those two names, placed beside each other in Helios's account, represent the full explanation that 9 days of searching had failed to produce. One name identified the act. The other identified the authority behind it. The abduction had not been rogue or hidden from the ordering of the cosmos. It had been arranged. Zeus, king of the gods and father of Persephone, had given his daughter to his brother. The marriage had been sanctioned at the highest level of divine power. Helios appears to have offered this information without reservation. Some later sources suggest he regarded the arrangement as reasonable, even as he acknowledged Demeter's distress. He was, in certain accounts, one of those who urged Demeter toward acceptance. The Homeric hymn does not dwell on this aspect of the exchange. It records the information given and moves forward. What it does register is the shift in Demeter's condition after this meeting. The 9 days of searching had been driven by not knowing. There was a kind of forward motion in that state, however agonized, the possibility that the next person asked would finally provide an answer, that the next road crossed would lead somewhere useful. Uncertainty, however terrible, contains a forward direction. Demeter had moved through the world with torches in both hands, because there remained something to find. After Helios spoke, she knew where Persephone was. She knew who had taken her. She knew that the taking had been permitted by the god who held the highest authority in the cosmos. There was nothing more to search for. The information was complete. The situation it described was fixed. This is the point at which the hymn marks a qualitative change in her grief. Before Helios, Demeter had been searching. After Helios, she was something else. The word the text reaches for is closer to wrath than sorrow, though the two are not cleanly separated. Scholars have long debated whether what the hymn describes in the period following this revelation is grief intensified to its extreme, or grief transformed into a different thing entirely. The answer likely depends on how one reads the relationship between emotion and will in the hymn's portrait of divine psychology. What the text makes clear is this: Demeter withdrew from Olympus. She withdrew from the assembly of the gods. She withdrew from the divine community to which she belonged, and which, in the form of Zeus, had arranged the loss she was living inside. She did not return to the upper slopes of the mountain. She did not accept any comfort or counsel from the gods who shared her place in the cosmic order. She came down from that height. She walked among mortals. She moved through the world without the attributes of her divinity made visible, without the marks by which a goddess could be recognized. She took the form of an old woman. This transformation is significant in ways that extend beyond the practical. An old woman moving along a road in the ancient world carried no particular divine authority. She would be seen or not seen. She would be spoken to with the uncertain courtesy that mortals extended to the elderly and unknown. She would be given water or not. She would be offered a place to rest or not. Demeter, goddess of grain, whose presence had sustained every harvest in the memory of the world, moved through that world as someone its inhabitants might not notice at all. Hecate, it appears, did not follow her into this disguise. The sources grow quiet about Hecate's movements at this point. She appears again later in the myth, at the moment of Persephone's return, carrying her torch once more, greeting the returning queen. What she did in the interval is not recorded in any surviving text with confidence. The two goddesses had walked together after their meeting in the dark. That much is established. Where they parted, and when, is one of the details that time has not preserved. Demeter walked alone. The road to Eleusis was not a short one. The sources do not describe the full route she travelled after leaving Helios's testimony behind. They show her arriving. There was a well there, a particular well, beside which the daughters of King Celeus of Eleusis would find her. Sitting in the shade of an olive tree, in the form of an old woman who had been walking a long time. This meeting was not yet recorded in the part of the narrative that falls to this chapter. What belongs here is the interval before it. The walking, the road. The earth moving under her feet as it had moved for 9 days before, but now without the forward purpose that searching provides. She knew where her daughter was. She could not reach her there. The knowledge sat in her like a stone in still water, present, unchanging, and without any direction it could point toward. Above her, the sky held the light of a day like any other. The grain in the surrounding fields stood at its autumn height. The air carried the dry, familiar scent of harvest approaching its end. A small bird moved through a row of barley and was still. None of it looked like a world in which something irretrievable had occurred. The road continued without ceremony. That is perhaps the most accurate statement that can be made about this portion of the narrative. The Homeric hymn does not linger here. It does not describe the texture of the path, the weather overhead, the names of the settlements Demeter may have passed through or around. Scholars working from the text alone have relatively little to reconstruct. What is known is the destination. What lies between the moment she began walking and the moment she arrived belongs to inference. She moved through a world that did not know what it was losing. The fields around her were still full. Farmers were still working their plots. Goats still moved along the dry hillsides. Children carried water. Smoke rose from cooking fires near the late afternoon hour. All of this continued without interruption. The earth had not yet understood that the goddess responsible for its fertility had withdrawn her attention from it. The famine had not yet begun. The soil had not yet hardened. The grain was still standing. This detail is worth holding for a moment. The catastrophe that the texts describe, the withering of crops, the silencing of the earth. The long famine that would eventually force Zeus's hand had not yet arrived. It would come later. It would come when Demeter reached Eleusis, entered the temple that would be built for her there, and sat in her grief without rising. But at this point on the road, the catastrophe was still ahead. The world looked ordinary. That was the condition of the interval. Several ancient accounts note a quality to this period that is difficult to name precisely. One might describe it as suspended. The goddess walked. The earth continued its autumn routines. The two facts occupied the same landscape without yet affecting one another. It would not remain that way. But during the walking, the separation held. Some scholars have compared this interval to the moment before a river reaches a falls. The water moves. It carries its usual surface. The sound has not yet begun. Only the direction is different from what it was before. Demeter's direction was Eleusis. Eleusis was not a large settlement by the standards of the Greek world. It sat on a coastal plain in the Attic region, set between hills to the north and the Saronic Gulf to the south. The plain itself was known for its grain. The Rarian plain, as some ancient sources call it, was considered among the most fertile ground in all of Attica. Whether this association with agricultural abundance preceded Demeter's arrival there, or was understood to result from it, varies depending on the account consulted. The well described in the Homeric hymn is identified by the text as the Parthenian. The name carries connotations of maidenhood, the maiden's well, or the well of the maidens. Scholars have noted the quiet irony in this detail. Demeter, searching for her daughter who had been the archetypal maiden, would come to rest at a place that bore that name. Whether the poet intended the resonance or merely preserved a local detail, it is present in the text. The olive tree above the well cast shade in the late afternoon. Demeter sat beneath it. She had been walking a long time. The form she wore, that of an old woman, made the sitting plausible. An old woman resting at a well would draw no particular attention. She would appear to be what she appeared to be, a traveller, aged and weary, pausing before the final portion of whatever road she was on. The daughters of King Celeus would come to the well to draw water. They would find her there. That encounter, and everything that followed from it, belongs to the next stage of the narrative. What can be said about the interval before they came is this: she waited. The olive leaves moved in a dry wind from the east. The light was low and yellow, the particular quality of autumn light that falls at an angle and gives ordinary things a longer shadow than they usually carry. The surface of the well held a dark circle of reflected sky. She did not look at it directly. She sat with her hands in her lap. The Homeric hymn describes her grief in this moment as deep and without outlet. The wrath that scholars identify in her condition after Helios's revelation was not, at this stage, an active force. It was present, but it had no form yet to move through. She had left the divine assembly behind. She had not yet spoken to the king's daughters. She had not yet entered Metanira's household. She had not yet been given the infant Demephon to care for. All of that was still ahead. For the moment, there was only the waiting. There is a motif that appears across several ancient traditions in their descriptions of the underworld, the image of dark water that holds everything and releases nothing. The rivers below the earth were said to carry different properties. One carried the forgetting that souls require before rebirth. Another carried the necessity that makes all things binding. They ran in silence through caverns that no living eye had ever fully mapped. Demeter could not reach those waters. She could not reach the place where Persephone now walked. The knowledge of that distance did not resolve into action. It settled. It sat inside her like something deposited by a current that had since gone still. Above the well, a single dry leaf released from the olive branch. It turned twice in the warm air before reaching the ground. It did not make a sound. Somewhere further down the road, toward the houses of Eleusis, a woman was calling out to someone whose name carried no meaning in the larger record of what this day would become. The call was answered. A door opened. A door closed. The shadow of the olive tree moved a little to the east as the afternoon continued. Demeter did not move with it. The daughters of King Celeus had not yet appeared along the path from the settlement. There was still time before they did. How much time, the sources do not say. The hymn compresses this interval. It shows Demeter seated. It shows the daughters arriving. What filled the space between those two images is not recorded in any account that has survived. Perhaps nothing did. Perhaps the waiting was exactly what it appeared to be, an old woman, a well, a tree, and the quiet of a late afternoon in autumn. The grain in the fields surrounding Eleusis stood at its full height. It had not yet been touched by what was coming. It moved slightly in the eastward wind. The stalks were pale and dry. They bent and straightened, bent and straightened. They would not be standing much longer, but they did not know that yet. The chapter plan assigns this section to a specific function, to step back from the present scene at Eleusis and recover what came before it, the origin of Persephone, the world as it existed before the abduction, the relationship between a goddess and her daughter that held, for a time, the order of all growing things. This is a reconstruction, as all such recoveries are. The sources available to scholars are partial. They begin, most of them, in the middle of things. They begin with the meadow already bright with narcissus, with the earth already opening, with the crisis already underway. The earlier condition, the world before the crack appeared in it, must be inferred from what the crisis revealed about what had been lost. What had been lost was this: a maiden who walked freely through fields that answered to her mother's care. She was called Kor. The word is old. It predates, in the estimation of several linguists, the elaborate mythological framework that would eventually surround it. Kor means simply the maiden, the girl, the young one who has not yet crossed from one stage into the next. It is a word that contains, embedded in its brevity, an entire category of existence, the time before, the state of not yet being changed by what is coming. Ancient inscriptions recovered from sanctuaries across the Greek world confirm that this name was used in religious contexts long before the longer story was fully standardized. Offerings were made to Kor. Prayers were addressed to Kor. The deity invoked by that name was understood to govern something essential about the early season, about the promise of harvest not yet fulfilled, about the grain standing in the field at the height of summer before it is cut. She was the daughter of two of the oldest organizing forces in the Greek religious imagination. Her father was Zeus, her mother was Demeter. The pairing is significant, not merely as genealogy, but as cosmological arrangement. Demeter governed the ground, the grain, the turning of soil and seed into sustenance. Zeus governed the sky above that ground, the rain that fed it, the ordering of seasons and celestial patterns that made agriculture possible. Between them, they held the full vertical range of the world that feeds living things. Kor, their daughter, stood at the point where those two domains met. She was the harvest potential itself, the ear of grain that contains next year's planting, the thing that is both end and beginning, depending on which direction one approaches it from. The Homeric hymn does not dwell on this before time at any length. It moves quickly to the meadow and the narcissus and the catastrophe, but the picture it assembles of the world prior to those events can be read in what it describes as lost. Demeter's grief causes the earth to fall barren, crops do not grow. Animals thin and weaken, the soil turns away from seed. These losses tell us, in reverse, what the world had contained: abundance, ease, the reliable cycling of growth through its appointed seasons, a mother who watched over what the earth produced, and a daughter who moved through that world as its living expression. The relationship between them, as several ancient sources describe it, was not merely familial. It was functional. It was the mechanism by which the seasons operated. Demeter's attention sustained the growing world. Kor's presence within that world confirmed that the cycle would continue. Her youth was not incidental. It was the point. The maiden who had not yet been taken was the proof that the harvest would come again. She was the future tense of the earth's abundance. Some accounts suggest that Kor spent her days in the company of the daughters of Oceanus, river nymphs, companions appropriate to a world of flowing water and growing things. The meadow they inhabited in those accounts is invariably described in terms of ease, flowers in abundance, ground that receives them without resistance, light that is even and generous, not angled and diminishing as it is now at Eleusis in this late autumn afternoon. That light, the meadow light, the light of before, cannot be recovered from the historical record. It exists only as an inference, as the light implied by its absence. What is recoverable is the structural logic of the arrangement, a goddess of grain who had a daughter who was also, in some sense, grain. The seed stored over winter is not dead, it waits. It holds the future inside a dry and silent exterior. The resemblance between Kor's disappearance into the earth and the annual disappearance of the seed into the soil was not lost on ancient commentators. Several early writers draw the parallel explicitly: the girl taken underground, the grain taken underground, both to return, both changed by the interval spent in darkness. Whether this parallel was the origin of the myth, or merely its most elegant interpretation, is a question the available sources cannot resolve. What they confirm is that the two ideas, the maiden's descent and the grain's winter stillness, were understood together, held in the same religious framework, honoured at the same sanctuaries. At Eleusis specifically, on the Rarian plain, where the grain still stands in the eastward wind, pale and full, bending and straightening. The woman seated at the Parthenion well knows the origin of her daughter better than any record does. She was present at it. She carried the child that would become Kor. She watched the maiden learn to move through fields that yielded to her touch, flowers opening as she passed, ground softening. She watched the world confirm, season by season, what Kor's existence meant to it. That knowledge now sits inside her in the form of its opposite. It does not move. It does not speak. It waits, as she waits, beneath the olive tree, in the long yellow light of an autumn afternoon, for something that will come down the road from the settlement. The daughters of King Celeus are near now. They have not yet appeared, but they are near. The sources indicate their arrival is close. The hymn's compression cannot hide the fact that the interval is ending. The dry leaf that fell earlier lies still on the ground beside the well. The water in the well does not move. The grain in the Rarian plain bends once more in the wind, straightens, and holds. The daughters of King Celeus came down the road in the late afternoon, 4 of them carrying their water jars. They walked without hurry. The road was familiar. The well was familiar. The woman seated beneath the olive tree was not. The Homeric hymn identifies them by name. Caladice, Clesidice, Demo, and Calithoe, 4 daughters of the king of Eleusis, sent to draw water as they had been sent on other afternoons. In other seasons, by a mother who expected them home before the light changed. What they found at the Parthenian well was a figure that did not match the place. An old woman, or so she appeared, seated, still, wearing the manner of someone who had been walking for a very long time and had simply stopped. The hymn notes that she resembled a woman past the age of childbearing, past the age of most things. That was the disguise. That was what grief, when it wraps itself in mortal form, looks like from the outside. The daughters approached. They asked the questions that courtesy required. Where had she come from? Did she have family? Was she in need? The woman gave them the name she had given herself in that time. She said she had come from Crete. She said her name was Doso. She said she had been taken by pirates and had escaped, and was now without family or destination. None of this was entirely false. She had been taken from. She had escaped nothing yet. She had no destination that the earth could offer her. The details arranged themselves into a shape that the daughters of Celeus could receive. They received it. What the sources preserve of this exchange is instructive not for its content but for its texture. The daughters of Celeus were kind. The hymn is clear on this point. They were not suspicious. They did not turn away. They offered what they had, which was an invitation, and they extended it without hesitation. Caladice spoke most in the hymn's account. She told the old woman that grief was something the gods assigned to mortals, and that mortals had no choice but to carry it. This was not cruelty. It was the ordinary comfort of people who had not yet understood that they were speaking to a goddess. She told Doso that she was welcome in Eleusis. The woman who was Demeter listened to this. The hymn does not record her expression. It cannot. But it records that she stood. After the long stillness beneath the olive tree, after the unmoving water and the motionless leaf and the grain bending and straightening on the plain, she rose. That is the transition the sources mark. Not a dramatic one, a slow one. The way a stone that has been sitting in cold ground retains its cold even after it is lifted, she went with them to the house of Celeus. The house itself is described in various accounts as substantial, without being palatial, stone floors. A hearth near the centre of the main room, Metanira, the queen, seated with her infant son Demephon in her arms. The child was young. The sources disagree on exactly how young. What they agree on is that he was healthy, and that his mother held him with the specific attention of someone who had perhaps feared, at some point, that she might not be able to. Metanira saw the old woman in the doorway. The hymn records that a divine light moved around her, though Metanira did not understand what she was seeing. Something in the stranger's manner caused the queen to stand and offer her own chair. Demeter declined, and sat instead on the plain seat that Iambe placed beneath her. Iambe was a servant in the household. The hymn credits her with the one moment of levity in the entire account of this period. She made the grieving goddess smile. The details of how she accomplished this are imprecise. The sources suggest jokes, or mimicry, or simply a kind of irrepressible warmth. Whatever it was, it broke something in the goddess's stillness briefly. She drank the kykeon that was offered, barley, water, and pennyroyal, the drink of mourners, the drink associated, in later Eleusinian practice, with the rites that honoured what had been lost and found. She did not drink wine. This detail the hymn is careful to preserve. She stayed. The arrangement that followed was quiet and domestic. Metanira asked if she would nurse the infant Demephon. Demeter agreed. What the queen was hiring was a nurse. What she received, though she could not have known it, was a goddess with grief enough to rewrite the nature of things. Demeter tended to Demephon with what the ancient sources describe as divine care. She anointed him with ambrosia, she breathed on him, and each night, after the household had grown quiet and the hearth fire burned low, she placed him within the fire. This is the detail that resists easy summary. Several commentators have attempted to explain it in rational terms, drawing on fire rituals and purification rites found elsewhere in Greek and ancient Mediterranean religious practice. The scholarly consensus holds that the ritual, whatever its precise mechanics, was intended to burn away the mortal part of the child, to remove from him the thing that would otherwise ensure his death. Demeter was attempting to give the infant something that had been denied to her daughter, permanence. The state of being past the reach of what takes things away. Night by night the child was held in fire and did not burn. The household did not know. The halls were quiet at that hour. Metanira slept. The daughters slept. The plain outside was dark and still, the grain motionless in the absence of wind. On one of those nights Metanira did not sleep. The hymn is not specific about why. Concern for her child, most accounts suggest. She had perhaps noticed something in the nurse's manner, the quality of attention that did not quite fit the figure of an ordinary woman. She rose and came to the doorway of the hall where the hearth stood. She saw her infant son in the fire. The scream she gave was immediate and involuntary. She seized the child. She pulled him from the flames, clutching him against her body, her voice pitched high with terror. The ritual broke. Whatever Demeter had been doing, whatever thread of divine intention had been pulling the mortal element from the child's nature, it severed at the sound. The goddess rose from where she had been crouching beside the hearth. The disguise fell. Not theatrically, simply. She straightened, and she was no longer the old woman from Crete. She was what she was. The child in Metanira's arms cried. He was unharmed. He would not be immortal. Demeter stood in the firelight of the house of Celeus and looked at the queen. The sources record very little of what passed between them in that moment. What they preserve is what came after. The goddess told the people of Eleusis what she required of them: a temple, a great altar, on the hill above the Raurian plain. She told them where to build it and how. She told them her name. The house of Celeus received that name in silence. The daughters, who had brought a grieving stranger in from the road with water jars balanced on their shoulders, now understood what they had carried home. The dry leaf outside the well, the still water, the grain on the plain that bent in the eastward wind and held. In the morning the building would begin. The temple was built in the days that followed. The sources are consistent on this point, if little else about the period. Celeus and the men of Eleusis worked quickly. The hill above the Raurian plain received the foundation stones before the season had shifted. Demeter withdrew into the structure the moment it was habitable. She did not return to Olympus. She did not resume her wandering. She sat within the new walls, and she was still. What followed is described in the ancient accounts as a famine. The word is accurate, though it perhaps understates the scope of what occurred. The goddess withdrew her attention from the earth, not in any single gesture, not with a pronouncement or a curse, simply as a person exhausted past a certain threshold turns away from a window, she ceased to tend. The grain on the Raurian plain, which had bent and held through the long weeks of her grief, ceased to grow. The seed in the soil did not push upward. The earth did not soften in the mornings. What had been planted did not come to harvest. What had not been planted had no reason to expect that it would be. The records from this period are, by necessity, fragmentary. no human hand was in a condition to keep detailed accounts. What survives are later reconstructions, theological commentaries, and the internal evidence of the Homeric hymn itself, which describes the situation in terms that are unmistakably final. The hymn's phrasing suggests that the withdrawal was total, that no stalk rose, that the ox pulled the plough through ground that returned nothing. Scholars have noted the precision with which the hymn distinguishes between Demeter's grief and her anger. They are not the same thing in the account's telling. The grief came first, and it produced wandering. The anger, which arrived only after she understood the full terms of what had been done, produced this, the stillness, the closed-off quality of a presence that had decided for the time being not to give. She sat in the temple on the hill. The plain below her was quiet in a way it had not been before, no insects in the dry grass, no movement in the soil. The wind came across from the sea as it had always come and passed over ground that offered it nothing to work with. No grain to bend, no leaves to turn. The plain received the wind, and the wind continued. It is worth pausing here on what the sources record about Demeter's inner state during this period, though the evidence is necessarily indirect. The Homeric hymn does not grant her interiority in the way that later literary traditions sometimes do. It describes her actions, her location, her refusals. But between those recorded details, certain things may be reasonably inferred. She had come a long distance. 9 days of torchlight searching, a disguise worn through the household of strangers, a ritual undertaken in the dark of someone else's hearth, with someone else's child, all of it oriented towards something she could not directly reach. The separation from Persephone had been in place for some time by now, and the hymn does not suggest that sitting in the new temple made it easier to bear. It suggests, rather, that she had arrived at a form of stillness that resembled endurance more than peace. This is a distinction the ancient sources do not always draw clearly. Several later commentators collapsed the two, but the hymn's account, read carefully, implies a goddess who had not ceased to grieve, who had only ceased to move while grieving. The effect on the world above was gradual at first, then less so. Animals fed on what remained in the fields and found less than they needed. The stores that households had put by from the previous harvest diminished. The prayers that rose from altars across the Greek world did not find the response they had before. Demeter was present in the sense that she was seated in her temple on the hill above Eleusis. She was not present in any other sense. The gods on Olympus grew attentive. The accounts vary on how quickly this concern developed and on who first brought it formally to Zeus's notice. Some sources suggest the alarm was immediate, others imply a longer period of observation. What the sources agree on is the mechanism by which the situation became urgent. The offerings from mortals thinned. The smoke that rose from altars across the earth carried less. Sacrifices require animals. Animals require grain. Grain had ceased to be available in any quantity. The chain of consequence moved slowly, but it moved in only one direction. The gods depend on mortal reverence. This is not a minor detail in ancient Greek theological understanding. It is a structural feature of how the relationship between the divine and human orders was conceived. When mortals starve, they do not sacrifice. When they do not sacrifice, the gods receive less. It is not that the gods weaken precisely, it is that something in the arrangement requires maintenance. Demeter understood this. The hymn implies she understood it and sat in the temple regardless. This is the aspect of the period that most interests later commentators, not the famine itself, but what it reveals about the limits of divine authority. Zeus had arranged the marriage. Zeus had the power to arrange it. And yet the consequence of that arrangement, once Demeter chose not to absorb it quietly, was a problem that required Zeus's attention. The earth going silent was not an accident. It was a form of reply. she sat. The plain was still. The soil held nothing in it. Somewhere below the surface of the earth, in a direction that the hymn describes but cannot locate precisely, Persephone was also in a state that the sources characterize as waiting. The two of them, mother and daughter, separated by the full depth of the world, were in a stillness that was not chosen and not entirely unchosen. This parallel is not drawn explicitly in the Homeric hymn. It is an inference, but it is an inference that later interpreters return to repeatedly across many centuries, because it holds something that the explicit account does not quite say. Grief shared across a distance does not diminish. It accumulates. It takes up residence in the body of the world. The grain did not grow. The river that ran near Eleusis carried the same cold water it had always carried, moving from the hills toward the sea at the pace such rivers maintain regardless of season. The water did not know about the famine. Water does not retain what passes through it. The river moved through the silent country and arrived at the sea unchanged, carrying nothing of the season's particular quality of loss. Demeter remained on the hill. On Olympus, the concern had become something that could no longer be set aside. Zeus had observed what the sources agree, he observed, the thinning of offerings, the failing of altars, the structural consequence of a world that could not feed itself moving toward a condition from which it might not recover. He had waited. Whether this waiting reflected uncertainty, or calculation, or something that later interpreters characterized as reluctance, the sources do not specify. What they record is the decision he eventually made, and the god he chose to carry it. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, and also something more precise than that title suggests. He was the only figure in the divine order who could pass between realms without disruption. He had moved between Olympus and the lower world before. He knew the roads that other gods did not travel. He carried his staff of intertwined serpents, the caduceus, and he moved through thresholds that resisted other presences. Zeus summoned him and gave the instruction plainly, "Go down. Speak to Hades. Bring Persephone back to the light." Hermes descended. The route he took is not described in detail by the Homeric hymn, and later accounts vary on the particulars. What remains consistent across traditions is the image of his arrival at the palace of Hades, a hall of dark stone, high-ceilinged, lit not by torches exactly, but by a quality of dim light that the lower world generated on its own terms. The sound of the rivers was present there, not loud but constant. Styx and Acheron moving in the deep, Lethe cold and hushed. The sound of water that never reached the sea. Persephone was there when Hermes arrived. The sources describe her as seated, which is a detail worth holding, not standing, not pacing. Seated in the hall of the underworld, in a posture the hymn does not further elaborate, but which later readers have understood as something between resignation and a stillness she had discovered on her own terms. She had been below the earth for a period the hymn does not count precisely, long enough that a certain quality of adjustment had occurred, or had begun to occur. Hermes delivered Zeus's message. Hades received it. The accounts of their exchange are brief in the Homeric hymn, suggesting that Hades did not argue at length, or that whatever argument occurred was not preserved in the canonical version. What the hymn records is that Hades agreed to release Persephone, and that before she left he gave her something to eat. The pomegranate was the fruit of the underworld. Not every ancient source agrees on this characterization, but the symbolic weight of the choice is consistent across traditions. Hades offered Persephone seeds from the fruit. The hymn says she ate them. It does not describe the moment in detail. It does not say whether she knew what eating in the realm of the dead would mean. Some later commentators argued she did not know. Others argued the text implies she did. The hymn itself leaves the question in a particular quality of ambiguity that may be deliberate. She ate 3 seeds, or 4, or 6. The number varies by source. The consequence was fixed regardless of the count. Having consumed food in the underworld, she was bound to it by a rule that preceded Zeus's authority and Hades' desire and Demeter's grief. The rule was older than any of them. It belonged to the structure of the world rather than to any individual who enforced it. To eat in the realm of the dead was to belong to it in part. Not entirely, but in part. Hermes brought Persephone upward. The route of ascent, like the route of descent, is left largely undescribed in the primary sources. The hymn moves from the moment of departure to the moment of arrival with the directness that characterizes its treatment of transitions. She was below. Then she was moving. Then the light changed. What the sources record about Zeus's response to the binding is also consistent. He sent Rhea, mother of both Zeus and Demeter, as the messenger who would eventually carry the terms of the negotiated arrangement, but that part belongs to what followed Persephone's return. What the sources fix here, in this chapter of events, is the fact of the binding itself, the terms that resulted from it. Persephone would spend a portion of each year in the upper world with Demeter under the light of the sun, and a portion of each year in the underworld, at Hades' side, in the dim hall with the sound of rivers below. The arrangement was set. It could not be unmade. The pomegranate seeds, small and dark red, already eaten, already part of her, were the hinge on which the whole negotiation turned. On the hill above Eleusis, inside the temple, Demeter still sat. She did not yet know the terms. She did not yet know her daughter was ascending. The plain below the hill was unchanged. The river near Eleusis moved at its usual pace from the hills toward the sea, carrying its cold water through the silent country. But somewhere beneath the surface of the world, in a direction that is difficult to name, something had shifted. A figure was moving upward through the dark. The pomegranate seeds were already doing what they had been given to do. And the deep stone corridors of Hades' hall were, for the first time in some while, one presence quieter. What the sources know of Persephone's time in the underworld before Hermes arrived is, by necessity, fragmentary. The Homeric hymn concerns itself with Demeter's grief above the earth, not with Persephone's interior experience below it. The period between the abduction and the negotiation receives only partial treatment, even in the most detailed ancient accounts. What remains is a collection of details, some consistent across traditions, some appearing only in later retellings, that together allow for a careful reconstruction of those weeks or months in the palace of Hades. The hall itself is described with some regularity. Dark stone, high ceilings. That quality of dim, self-generated light that ancient writers struggled to characterize precisely, since it resembled neither torchlight nor daylight nor anything that exists in the upper world. The air was cool. It did not move in the way that air moves above the earth, stirred by wind or changing weather. It was still. Consistently, uniformly still. The sound of the rivers carried through the stone. Styx, deep and slow. Acheron, with its colder current. Lethe, which the accounts describe as hushed, even by the standards of the underworld. The rivers did not rush. They moved steadily and without urgency through the dark, and their sound permeated the palace the way that a distant tide permeates a house built near the sea. Persephone moved through this environment. The records, such as they are, do not describe her as confined to a single chamber. Later artistic representations and the brief references scattered through Hellenistic sources suggest she occupied the hall, the corridors, the outer courts of the palace. She walked among the rooms of the dead king's dwelling and came to know their dimensions. There were souls in the underworld. This is consistent across all traditions. The plain of Asphodel, which several ancient sources describe as lying not far from the palace, was populated by the common dead. These were not heroic figures awaiting judgment, They were the ordinary souls of the ordinary dead, those who had lived neither with great virtue nor with remarkable wickedness, and who drifted now through the asphodel meadows in a condition that the ancient writers characterized variously as peaceful and as pale, as undisturbed and as simply diminished. They moved among the grey-white flowers. They did not speak much. Their voices, when present at all, were quiet. Persephone encountered them. The sources that address her developing authority in the underworld describe a figure who was not passive in the presence of the dead. Though she had not yet fully occupied the role that would later be attributed to her, she observed. She was present in a way that Hades, for all his governance, was not always present. Hades administered. Persephone attended. Whether this distinction was recognized by Hades during those early months is not recorded. The Homeric hymn does not give him interiority of the kind that would allow speculation. He appears in the hymn as a figure of action and, in the end, of compliance. What he thought of the goddess seated in his hall, what he said to her during the long periods before Hermes' arrival, is not preserved. What is preserved, or can be inferred from later accounts, is Persephone's adjustment to the rivers. Scholars working from the scattered references in Pindar and Plato and the much later Orphic texts have suggested that Persephone's relationship to Lethe deserves particular attention. Lethe was the river of forgetting. Souls drank from it before rebirth, releasing the memory of their previous lives. Persephone did not drink from it. She could not forget. She retained the memory of the meadow, the narcissus, the sudden opening of the earth beneath her feet. This is one of the wild thresholds that the sources invite but do not fully cross. The boundary between what Persephone remembered and what she allowed herself to hold on to is not described by any ancient account with precision. Some later commentators suggested her memory of the upper world was what preserved her from full absorption into the underworld's silence. Others suggested the memory was a source of difficulty rather than strength. The ancient writers were not uniform on this point. What they are uniform on is this: Persephone did not dissolve into the underworld. She remained distinct within it. She kept some quality that was her own, that did not belong to the stone halls or the still air or the slow rivers. Ancient vase paintings frequently represent her with flowers, even in the underworld context. One bowl from a Sicilian workshop, dated to the 4th century BC, shows her holding a single stalk with a narrow bloom, seated in what appears to be the palace of Hades. Whether the artist worked from a specific textual tradition or from a more general understanding of her character is impossible to determine now. But the image appears often enough across different regional traditions to suggest that the flower was considered a persistent attribute, not an incidental detail. She carried something of the upper world with her. The meadow she had left behind, the daughters of Oceanus, the open sky she could no longer see, all of it remained in her as a kind of interior reference point. The records do not suggest she spoke of it often, but she had not relinquished it. The asphodel meadows, when she walked near them, were quiet. The souls there moved with the unhurried drift of things that have released urgency. They did not address her directly, at least not in any account that has survived. She observed them from a distance that the sources do not measure precisely. Close enough to see their faces, far enough that the interaction, if it occurred, was not preserved as a named exchange. Hades' palace had other chambers, rooms that the sources mention without describing fully. A hall where judgment occurred, though the mechanics of judgment in this period of Persephone's time there are not detailed. The presence of Minos and the other judges belongs more properly to later chapters of the tradition, when Persephone's authority had become established rather than nascent. For now, in this period, she moved, she observed. She sat in the high-ceilinged hall and listened to the rivers. She noted the way that light behaved in the underworld, how it did not change with the passage of what would have been day and night above the earth. There was no morning here. There was no dusk. There was only the same consistent dimness, the same still air, the same sound of water moving through deep channels in the dark. She was a goddess. She adapted, but she did not pretend that adaptation was the same as belonging. Somewhere far above her, through rock and soil and the rooted darkness of the world's deep interior, the plain near Eleusis lay cold and unplanted. The river moved from the hills toward the sea. Demeter sat in her temple. The two of them, mother and daughter, separated by the whole depth of the earth, waited without knowing that the other was waiting. Persephone rested one hand against the cool stone of the hall's wall. The surface was smooth. It had no texture that resembled anything from the upper world. It was simply stone. Dark, cold, cold. Present, she listened to the rivers. They continued, as they always did, moving through the deep places of the world, without hurrying, without arriving, without rest. The rivers did not stop. That much is certain from even the earliest accounts. The rivers of the underworld moved continuously, without pause, without season. They had no banks in the way that surface rivers have banks. They moved through deep channels in the stone, and their sound rose through the floors and walls of the palace, the way that heat rises through the earth in summer. Persephone would have been aware of them always. Not as intrusion, not as comfort. Simply as fact. What the sources begin to describe in this period is not Persephone's inner adjustment, which remains largely beyond the reach of the record, but the world around her, the underworld itself. The geography that she had inherited, not by choice, but by the circumstances that the ancient sources record with varying degrees of precision. It was a structured place. This is perhaps the detail that surprises modern readers most, those encountering the ancient accounts for the first time. The underworld of Greek religious tradition was not a uniform darkness. It had regions. It had distinctions. It had a cartography, though no map has survived, that could be called authoritative, and the ancient writers themselves disagreed on certain particulars. The broadest division, the one most consistently attested across sources from Hesiod forward, was between those regions designated for the dead of different categories. The most ordinary souls, the vast majority, those who had lived without notable virtue or notable crime, went to the asphodel meadows. This was not punishment. It was simply where most people went. The grey-white flowers grew there in long, low rows. The souls moved among them without particular urgency. The sources describe this region as neither dark nor light, neither painful nor pleasant. A kind of continuance, a place of ordinary time, emptied of its ordinary content. Beyond the asphodel meadows, further from the palace, lay Elysium. The sources are somewhat more consistent on this point than on others. Elysium was a place of ease, of something that the ancient writers called blessedness, though they varied in their descriptions of what that meant in practice. The heroes went there, those whom the gods had favoured in life. Pindar describes it with warmth and gold, with breezes that were not the wind of the upper world, but something analogous. A softness in the air. Later traditions added the Isles of the Blessed as a further gradation, a place reserved for those who had achieved Elysium 3 separate times. The distinctions grew more elaborate with each generation of writers who addressed them. Tartarus was different from both. It lay at the bottom of everything. Hesiod, in the Theogony, places it as far below the earth as the earth is below the sky. A depth beyond measurement. It was not where most souls went. It was where those who had offended the gods directly were sent. The Titans held there after their defeat, Tantalus for his crimes against the divine, Sisyphus for his cleverness used against divine order, Ixion for transgressions against the order of hospitality that the gods considered inviolable. The punishments there were continuous. They did not end. The accounts of Sisyphus rolling his stone, of Tantalus standing in water that receded as he reached for it. These appear across enough independent traditions to suggest a genuine and widespread religious understanding, not merely literary invention. Cerberus stood at the gate. The sources are uniform on this point as well. He was the guardian of the entrance, the three-headed hound, whose function was to prevent the living from entering freely and the dead from leaving at all. The ancient writers vary in their descriptions of him. Some sources give him a single head with multiple faces. Others, the three-headed image that later became canonical, with a serpent's tail and serpents growing from his back. The precise form matters less than the function. He stood at the threshold. He enforced the boundary between the living world and the dead one. No soul passed him without authorization. Minos sat in judgment. So did Rhadamanthus and Aeacus. These three had been kings and lawgivers in their mortal lives, and their appointment as judges of the dead reflects an ancient Greek understanding that the qualities of a good judge, fairness, patience, knowledge of precedent, did not disappear at death, but could be put to use in a different form. They assessed each soul. They assigned each soul its destination. The mechanics of this process are not detailed with precision in any single source. The Platonic dialogues touch on it, and later Orphic texts elaborate, but the tradition is not uniform. What the sources do suggest, without stating it directly, is that Persephone's role in this structure was distinct from Hades. He administered. She attended. She moved among the dead in a way that the accounts of later petitioners confirm. When Orpheus descended, he appealed to both of them. When Heracles came for Cerberus, he passed through the palace and the presence of both. The petitions brought before the rulers of the dead were addressed to both, not to one or the other alone. This was not a detail that the ancient sources elaborated with care. It was simply assumed. The dual rulership appears in the textual record as a given, not an argument. Persephone is queen of the dead because she is there, because she remained distinct within the place rather than dissolving into it, because she brought with her from the upper world a quality of attention that the dead recognized. The plain of Asphodel, in the accounts that survive, is a quiet place. The souls there did not clamour. They drifted. They held the shapes of their former selves without fully being those selves any longer. They had released urgency. They had released most of what had organized their living days into sequence and meaning. Persephone, walking near them, had released none of it. She still remembered the meadow. The light. The specific weight and texture of a flower held in a living hand. She carried that memory through the still air of the underworld, the way that the rivers carried water through the channels of the deep stone, continuously, without arriving, without ceasing. She had not yet received petitioners. That would come later, when her authority had solidified into something the sources could name and record. For now she walked the corridors of the palace. She stood in the outer courts where the air was slightly less still. She returned to the high-ceilinged hall and sat in the chair that had been placed beside Hades's own, the chair that, by its position, named her what she had not yet fully become. She placed her hand flat against the stone of the armrest. The surface was smooth beneath her palm. Dark and cold and present, as the walls were, as the floor was, as everything in this place was. She waited. Above her, at a depth that no distance in the upper world could measure accurately, the asphodel roots pressed downward through the dark soil between this world and the one she had come from. They did not break through. They simply grew toward whatever was below them, the way that roots do, without knowing what they will find, following the pull of deep ground. The pomegranate itself appears in the textual record with a consistency that scholars find striking. Across the major sources, the Homeric hymn, the Orphic fragments, the later Latin elaborations, the fruit is always present. The details vary. The number of seeds consumed ranges from 3 to 6, depending on the tradition consulted. The circumstances of the eating are described differently in different accounts, some suggesting deception, others suggesting something closer to knowledge and acceptance. But the pomegranate itself does not vary. It is always there. It is always the thing that settles the matter. What the ancient sources do not explain, because they did not need to explain it to their original audiences, is what the act of eating meant within the structure of their religious understanding. The scholars who study these texts have offered interpretations. Food consumed in the realm of the dead binds the one who eats to that realm. This is not stated as a rule in any single authoritative source. It appears as an assumption underlying the narrative, the way that physical laws underlie observed phenomena without being separately announced. Persephone ate, she was bound. The connection between those two facts required no elaboration for the communities that preserve these stories. What interests later scholars is not the rule but the fruit itself. The pomegranate was not a casual choice. In the agricultural world of ancient Greece, the pomegranate carried specific associations. It was a fruit of late autumn. It ripened as other things declined. Its skin was dark red, and its interior was dense with seeds, each one enclosed in its own translucent membrane, arranged in chambers separated by pale dividing walls. To open a pomegranate was to find abundance within enclosure, productivity within a space that appeared from the outside to contain nothing at all. The ancient writers understood this. The pomegranate as a symbol appears across Greek religious art and votive practice in contexts that connect it to both fertility and death, and this dual association was not seen as contradictory. It was seen as the nature of the fruit itself. Persephone held one in the accounts that attempt to reconstruct her state during those early days in the palace. The sources that describe this moment are late and speculative. No early text provides a careful account of what she thought or felt in the interval before she ate. What the later traditions preserve, drawing on older material that has mostly not survived, is an image of her seated in the dark hall with the fruit in her hands. The pomegranate was cool. Smooth on the outside, the way that the stone of the armrest was smooth, the weight of it was familiar in a way that the stone was not. It was the weight of something grown in soil, in light, in weather. It carried in its density the accumulated days of its ripening. Scholars cannot say with certainty that Persephone understood this at the time of her eating. They can only note that she had gathered flowers in sunlit meadows for long enough to know the feel of a living thing held in a living hand. The seeds were small. This also the later accounts note, with the particularity that suggests the detail was considered significant, not the whole fruit. Seeds only, each one a point of deep red against her palm. Each one tasting, the fragmentary Orphic materials suggest, of the earth itself, not soil exactly, but the mineral darkness beneath soil, the taste of the deep ground from which all surface things grow upward. She ate. However many seeds the particular tradition records, she ate them. And what the sources describe afterward is not transformation, but recognition. Not the violent alteration of one thing into another, but the quiet acknowledgement of something that was already becoming true. She had walked the corridors. She had sat in the chair. She had placed her hand against the cold stone and waited in the unchanging air. The eating did not make her queen of the dead. It named what the staying had already begun to make her. This is a distinction that scholars find worth maintaining. The pomegranate is often described in popular retellings as a trap, as a mechanism of imprisonment. The ancient sources are more ambiguous. They present the eating as consequential without clearly establishing whether it was unwilling. The Homeric hymn, the most authoritative early source, is not explicit on this point. Later accounts diverge. Some emphasize Hades' deliberate offering and the element of deception. Others describe the eating in language that suggests at least partial understanding on Persephone's part. What the sources agree on is the result. She was divided, partially bound to the underworld, partially free to return to the upper world for a portion of each year. The pomegranate seeds became the hinge between two seasons, two realms, two states of being. not a door that closed, but a door that swung both ways at different times, according to the arrangement that Zeus and Demeter and Hades would later work out through negotiation. In the palace, Persephone sat with the taste still present. The deep stone walls rose around her. The rivers moved below the floor, audible always, continuous through their stone channels. The air was still and cool and neither painful nor pleasant. Everything here was as it had been. Nothing here altered in response to what she had done. Above the palace, above the layers of rock and dark earth, the asphodel roots pressed slowly through the soil. They did not know what they were moving toward. They simply followed the pull of whatever was below them in the manner of roots everywhere, patient, directed, without understanding. She set the empty husk of the pomegranate down against the stone beside her. The dark red of it was still vivid against the pale stone. It would not decay here. Nothing decayed here. It would remain exactly as it was, the chambers emptied, the pale inner walls intact, the outer skin still holding its shape. She looked at it for a long moment. The sound of the rivers moved through the floor beneath her feet. The walls were close and quiet. She did not know yet how many seasons would pass before the terms of her return were settled. She did not know the precise form the agreement would take, or the name her mother was even then calling out across the darkening surface of the earth above her. These things were still unresolved, still unfolding in the world she had come from, in the time that still moved up there. Down here, time did not move. Down here she sat with the small redness of the emptied pomegranate beside her hand and the weight of the seeds still present in her body, and the memory of the meadow light still present in her mind, both of them hers now, both of them real. The resolution came from above, as all resolutions in that time did. High on the surface, Demeter had not relented. The sources agree on this with unusual consistency. She had withdrawn from the world and seated herself in her temple at Eleusis, and she had made the earth reflect her state. Grain did not grow. The soil lay hard and pale beneath a cold light. Animals moved across fields that offered nothing. Mortals prayed to gods who could not answer the prayer that mattered, which was for the ground to open again and yield its ordinary abundance. Zeus, who had arranged the marriage and kept his arrangement quiet for as long as he was able, was finally compelled to act. The texts are clear enough on the sequence. He sent messengers. He sent several in the accounts that have survived. Each returned having failed to move Demeter from her position. She would return her gifts to the earth when her daughter returned to her, not before, not under any other conditions. The sources then describe the sending of Rhea. This detail carries more significance than it might first appear to hold. Rhea was not a god of persuasion in the way that Hermes was. She was not a figure associated with clever speech or diplomatic arrangement. She was something older. She was the mother of both Zeus and Demeter. She was the one who had wrapped a stone in cloth and held it out to Kronos in place of a child, buying time for what came afterward. When the accounts place Rhea on the road to Eleusis, they are not describing the sending of an ambassador. They are describing the sending of a mother to her daughter. The distinction mattered to the ancient scholars who preserved these texts. It continues to matter to those who read them now. What Rhea carried was not a legal arrangement. The records do not present her arrival in the language of formal negotiation. She came, the Homeric hymn suggests, as someone who understood grief from inside it, who had held her own children and then lost them, and then, in time, found them again in forms she had not anticipated. She had some knowledge of what Demeter was sitting inside. The conversation between them is not preserved in any source that has survived intact. Fragments from later commentaries suggest it was not brief. The Rarian plain, which lies near Eleusis, and which the later tradition identifies as the site of the meeting, was known in antiquity as a place of ancient agricultural sanctity. It was considered among the oldest cultivated ground in the world. That Rhea found Demeter there, or brought her there is consistent with the symbolism that the ancient writers preferred. The ground that had stopped growing was also the ground where the negotiation began. The terms that emerged were these. Persephone would spend a portion of each year in the underworld with Hades, and the remaining portion on the surface of the earth with Demeter. The precise division varies by source. The Homeric hymn assigns her 1/3 of the year below and 2/3 above. Later accounts sometimes adjust this proportion, and the adjustment does not appear to have disturbed the underlying theological framework, which depended not on exact fractions, but on the principle of division itself. 2 places, 2 portions, 1 figure moving between them. Down in the underworld, none of this had been resolved yet. Persephone sat in the dark hall. The rivers continued through their channels below the floor. The emptied pomegranate rested against the stone. The air was unchanged. She did not feel the approach of any resolution. This is noted in at least one late fragmentary source, which speculates that the underworld stillness was total enough to prevent any knowledge of the surface world from penetrating. No warmth moved down through the rock, no sound descended. What happened above happened at a distance that could not be measured in the terms available to those who stood below. When Hermes came, he came as he always did, without much ceremony. The literary sources describe his descents into the underworld with a consistency of detail that suggests a well-established tradition. He wore his winged sandals. He carried his staff. He moved through the underworld's corridors as someone familiar with the route, which he was, given his role as guide of souls to the dead. His presence there was not unusual. His errand was. The message he carried was from Zeus. Persephone was to be permitted to return to the upper world. The arrangement had been made, the terms were settled. Demeter had agreed. The earth would receive its goddess back, and Persephone would make the passage upward. And the ground would respond. The sources diverge slightly on what was said between Persephone and Hades at this moment of departure. Some accounts emphasize Hades' reluctance to release her. Others describe him as composed, already aware of the terms, accepting the arrangement without visible resistance. The Homeric hymn presents Hades speaking directly to Persephone before she goes, telling her that in the underworld she would have authority, that she would rule alongside him, that those who wronged her would face consequences that he would ensure. The speech, as preserved, reads less like a farewell than a statement of what she would return to. Whether Persephone found this comforting is not recorded. The ancient texts are careful here. They do not presume to report her interior state at this moment. They describe what was said and what followed. What followed was the ascent. The Homeric hymn places the reunion on the Rarian plain. Demeter came forward. Persephone came forward. The text describes them moving toward each other without elaborating further on the physical details of the meeting. Some details, the ancient poets understood, are diminished by description. The reunion is preserved in the record primarily through its effects. Demeter's grief lifted. The ground responded. The first grain pushed up through the dark soil. The Rarian plain, which had lain fallow and cold, began to move with the first tentative motion of growing things. The accounts also record that Hecate was present. She had heard Persephone's cry at the moment of the abduction, long before any other deity had understood what had happened. The torch she carried, then she carried still. The sources note that from this reunion forward, Hecate walked beside Persephone, not as a servant and not as a guard, but as a companion marked by the same originating moment. They had both been present at the beginning of this story, though Hecate had stood in the dark of her cave and Persephone had stood in the open light of the meadow. And neither had yet understood what the narcissus had already set in motion. The earth above the Rarian plain held the first green of a returning season. Small and close to the ground, not abundant yet. Not the full weight of summer, but the first sign that the long cold had reached its limit. Below that green, the roots continued their movement through the dark soil, patient, without understanding, following the pull of what lay beneath them. They did not know what season was beginning above their heads. They grew regardless, as roots do, down through the dark toward the rivers they could not hear. The Rarian plain held its quiet for some time after the reunion. The first green had come. Not much. A thin line of growth along the lowest ground, where water gathered and the soil was least hardened. But it had come. The scholarly record notes that ancient sources treat this moment with particular care, describing the earth's response not as immediate abundance, but as gradual recognition. The ground remembered what it had forgotten. It moved slowly, the way cold things move when warmth returns. Demeter did not return at once to her full work. The sources describe her remaining near Eleusis for some days, near the temple, near the plain she had watched turn pale. This is consistent with what the ancient texts suggest about grief's withdrawal. It does not end at the moment relief arrives. It requires its own time, its own receding. Persephone, the records indicate, also required time. The adjustment moved in both directions. What the later accounts concern themselves with, and this is where the historical record becomes richest, most detailed, most corroborated across independent sources, is not the reunion itself, but what came after it, what Persephone became, what her authority, now formalized, now divided across two kingdoms, meant in practice, how it was exercised. The accounts of those who descended to the underworld and encountered her there are among the most thoroughly preserved records in the entire mythological corpus. Orpheus is the earliest figure the sources associate with a descent made out of love rather than necessity. The musician came down through the earth's passages with his lyre and played his way through the underworld's corridors. The ancient texts describe the music as stopping the rivers, stopping the judges at their work, stopping even the dead in whatever passage they were making through the asphodel meadows. The sources describe it as the kind of sound that reached whatever remained of feeling in those who had long since ceased to feel. Persephone heard it. The accounts agree on this point. She was seated in the dark hall when Orpheus came forward. He stood before her throne. He did not petition Hades first, or so the majority of sources suggest, though some versions place Hades present at the judgment. He addressed himself to Persephone directly. He asked for Eurydice. He named her. He described what he had lost. The music had already said most of it. He said the rest with words that the ancient sources preserve in fragments, careful language about the common fate of all things. About the debt the upper world would eventually pay regardless, about asking only to borrow back what would come to Persephone in time, she deliberated. This detail appears across multiple accounts and is treated with some emphasis. She did not respond immediately. She considered what had been asked. Then she agreed to grant it, subject to the condition that Orpheus not look back as he led Eurydice upward through the passage. The condition was not arbitrary. Several ancient commentators analyze it at length. Some interpret it as a test of trust, others as a measure of faith, others still as simply the mechanism by which the underworld preserved its boundary. The rule that ensured the threshold remained a threshold. Persephone did not explain it. The sources do not preserve any explanation she offered. She granted the petition and stated the terms. The rest followed from there. What followed is well documented. The point the later accounts return to is her role in granting what was asked at all. She could have refused. Hades had made no prior arrangement for such a case. There was no precedent. The underworld had received its dead and kept them. That was its function. Persephone looked at Orpheus and his lyre and his grief, and she made a decision that the institution she governed had not prepared her for, because it had never happened before. The record describes this as characteristic of her later judgments. Heracles came next in the sequence of significant descents, though the ancient sources do not agree on the precise ordering relative to other events. He came with permission from Zeus, and with Athena and Hermes accompanying him, which simplified the passage considerably. His errand was Cerberus. He had been assigned the task of bringing the three-headed hound to the upper world temporarily as the last of his labours. The accounts place him before Persephone in the dark hall. She received him formally. She did not resist the request. She placed two conditions on it: that Heracles take the animal by force of hand alone, using no weapons, and that he return Cerberus when the errand was complete. These are consistent terms across the majority of surviving sources, practical terms in context, appropriate to the nature of the request and to the nature of the one making it. Heracles agreed. He succeeded by the strength of his hands. He returned Cerberus when the task was finished. Persephone's handling of the encounter is described in the sources with what might be characterized as economical authority. She assessed what was asked. She identified the appropriate conditions. She communicated them and did not pursue the matter further. The records suggest no ceremony around the decision, no extended deliberation. She had been governing the dead long enough by this point that such requests, unusual as they were, had their own familiar shape. The case of Psyche is recorded somewhat differently, and later, primarily in Roman sources, most completely in Apuleius's account from the 2nd century AD. Psyche arrived in the underworld carrying a small box sent by Aphrodite to collect a portion of Persephone's beauty. The errand was designed to be impossible. That is how Apuleius frames it, though scholars note his evident sympathy for Psyche throughout. Persephone received her. She filled the box. She returned it closed, with an instruction not to open it. The sources describe her as composed and unhurried through the exchange, neither hostile nor particularly warm. She did what was asked. The box was filled. The instruction was given. The rest depended on Psyche. What the scholars who have examined these accounts note across centuries of commentary is a consistent quality in how Persephone appears in each. She is not easily moved by flattery. She is not swayed by the names or the reputations of those who stand before her. Orpheus moved her with genuine grief expressed through genuine art. That is the case the sources treat as exceptional. The others she handled with a measured attention that did not bend toward sentiment. This is consistent with what one would expect of a figure who had spent long seasons in the presence of the dead. The dead do not require sentiment. They require judgment. They require someone willing to hold the boundary and, where the boundary permits, to open it with appropriate conditions attached. The records do not describe what Persephone thought of her own authority. The ancient texts, as noted elsewhere in this account, are reserved about her interior life. They preserve what she said and what she did. They leave the rest to inference. What can be inferred is this: she sat in the dark hall and the petitioners came to her. The rivers moved through their channels below the floor. The air was unchanged. The pomegranate seeds had bound her here for part of every year, and in that binding she had found a work that was entirely her own. None of the descending heroes had come for Kor, the maiden who gathered flowers on the Nysian plain. They had come for the queen who kept the dead. They had come to her because she was the one who could grant what they needed, because she was the one with the authority to say yes or no. On the Rarian plain above, the thin green of early spring continued its slow spread through the dark soil. The plain above was visible to no one in the dark hall, but Persephone knew it was there. This is what the later sources note with some consistency, that she retained across every season spent below a precise awareness of what the upper world was doing, not a longing exactly. The accounts are careful to distinguish it from longing, more a readiness. The way a river knows the shape of its channel without requiring light to navigate it. She had been sitting on her throne for long enough that the stone of it had grown familiar in the way that only sustained presence creates. The weight of it was known to her. The grain of the dark rock, smooth where her hands rested at the arm, the slight elevation of the dais beneath her feet. These things she no longer noticed, which is to say, she had fully arrived inside them. In the dark hall, a small bronze lamp burned on its stand to her left. This was a newer addition to the hall. Hades had placed it there without explanation, and Persephone had accepted it without comment. It produced no meaningful light. The flame was narrow and pale, and it illuminated nothing more than the immediate air around it. But it created a sound, very faint, the sound of a small fire consuming what it had been given, and this Persephone had come to find useful as a marker of time. In the underworld, where nothing changed and no wind moved and no bird called from any distance, a small sound of that kind served to make the silence measurable. She was not waiting. She had no petition before her at present. The rivers moved below, and the dead drifted through the asphodel meadows in their quiet way. And the hall was still. This was what the ancient scholars most often failed to account for in their reconstructions, the quality of the time between events. The time when Persephone sat, and no hero descended and no extraordinary request was brought before her. The time of ordinary governance. The time of simply being present in the dark hall with the narrow flame and the rivers and the dead drifting through the meadows below. She had spent a great deal of her existence in this time. More than the records reflect. The records reflect the arrivals. They do not reflect the long stretches of quiet governance that made those arrivals possible to handle as well as she did. The meadow on the Nysian plain was somewhere she could not quite remember from the inside. She could describe it. She knew its flowers. She knew the names of the daughters of Oceanus who had gathered there beside her. She knew the narcissus. She knew the light. But the sensation of standing in it, the feeling of the grass under her feet and the warm air moving across her arms, that had become the property of memory rather than of the body and memory. Over time, in the dark, becomes a kind of knowledge rather than a kind of feeling. This is not loss exactly, or not only loss. Persephone had turned this over for a long time. The accounts record nothing of these interior deliberations, but the physical evidence of her manner before petitioners suggests a mind that had spent considerable time in careful thought about its own situation. She was not the maiden who had reached for the narcissus with both hands. That figure still existed, in the sense that everything that had happened was part of the sequence that had led to this hall, this throne, this narrow flame. But the maiden was not a self she could step back into. She had become something that the Nysian plain would not have recognized, nor was she only the queen who kept the dead. That framing, used so often in the surviving texts, was accurate as far as it went. She governed here. She judged here. She held the boundary between the dead and the living with the precision that the work required. But there was also the other part of the year, the months when she ascended to the upper world, and the earth opened its grain, and the flowers returned, and Demeter moved again across the Rarian plain with her quiet. Steady attention. Persephone moved through that part of the year as well. She knew the warmth. She knew the grass. She carried the memory of the hall with her into the light, and she carried the memory of the light back into the hall. The ancient sources are uncertain what to make of this. Some read it as a kind of permanent division, as though she were always half in one place and half in another, never wholly present wherever she stood. Others read it differently. They note the competence of her governance. They note the decisiveness with which she handled Orpheus and Heracles and Psyche. They note that Demeter, in the months when Persephone returned above, was restored to full function, not fragmented, not partial. The scholars in this second group suggest that the division was not an injury, that the two halves of her year were not two halves of a broken self, but two full seasons of a complete one. The thin flame on the bronze stand bent very slightly. There was no wind in the dark hall, but the flame moved as small flames do, responsive to changes too subtle to name. Persephone looked at it. The Rarian plain above was somewhere in its first thin days of green. She knew this the way she knew the shape of the stone chair, without requiring light, without requiring evidence. The soil was loosening there, and the first narrow shoots were finding their way through the dark ground toward an air that was beginning, very slowly, to warm. She would ascend when the time came. Until then the hall held her. And she held the hall, and the narrow flame burned steadily on its stand, and the rivers moved through their channels beneath the floor with the low, continuous sound of water that has never once stopped. The time came without announcement. There was no signal from above. No messenger descended, no change in the rivers, no shift in the sound of the asphodel meadows. Only the knowledge, arriving in Persephone as it always did, precise and unhurried, that the upper world had crossed a threshold. The soil was no longer only loosening. The first green was no longer only first. Something had opened. She rose from the stone chair. The dark hall held the impression of her stillness for a moment after she left it. The flame on the bronze stand continued to burn. The rivers continued beneath. The records of her ascent are fragmentary. Most accounts attend only to the outcome, the earth responding, the flowers, the grain. The ascent itself is described briefly, if at all. Scholars working with the later Eleusinian sources have noted that the ritual language used in those ceremonies suggested the ascent was understood as gradual rather than instantaneous, a rising, a slow return of light to a figure who had been long without it. What can be reconstructed from the physical evidence and the surviving hymnic fragments is this: Persephone moved through the passage between the deep world and the upper one. The stone around her changed in character as she rose, the texture of it, the temperature. The dark that had been the particular dark of the underworld, absolute and familiar, became something else, a lesser dark, a dark that admitted the possibility of its own ending. And then the air changed. This detail appears in several ancient accounts, phrased in different ways depending on the source and the period. The air of the upper world reached her before she reached it. It came down to meet her. The hymnic sources describe it as carrying the smell of wet soil and early grass. One Hellenistic fragment, now incomplete, adds the smell of water moving over stone. She emerged. The Rarian plain was pale with early spring. The sky above it was the colour that sky becomes in those first weeks of the year. When the light has not yet returned to full strength, and the world seems made of something thinner than it will be later, the grass was short. The flowers were not yet open, but they were there, folded and waiting. And the earth under her feet was soft. Persephone stood on the surface of the world and felt the air move across her. The sources do not record whether she paused or for how long. They attend to Demeter. They attend to what happened to the earth. They note the rapid thickening of the green across the plains, the grain beginning to show in the newly ploughed fields of the Rarian region, the birds returning. These phenomena are described with care and reverence. They are understood as the visible proof of reunion. What is less examined is the figure of Hecate. She was there. The Homeric hymn to Demeter records it plainly, though the detail is frequently passed over. Hecate came to Persephone when she ascended. The sources describe her approaching with torches. This imagery is consistent with Hecate's other appearances in the mythological record. She was, and had long been, a figure who moved with light in the dark, torchlight. The light carried by hand through the places where other light did not reach. Hecate had heard the cry. On the day of the abduction, when Persephone's voice had reached the peaks of mountains, Hecate had heard it from her cave. She had not seen who had taken the maiden. But she had heard, and she had followed Demeter in the search, walking beside her in the days that came after. The hymn records this without elaboration. It simply notes that Hecate was present. that she accompanied Demeter, that she carried her torches through those 9 days and nights. She was present now as well, the two of them, Persephone ascending. Hecate, waiting at the boundary, met on the threshold between the deep world and the plain. The sources do not record their exchange in detail. Some scholars have proposed that no exchange was recorded because none occurred, that the meeting was conducted in a silence that required no language. The torchlight, the emerging figure, the recognition between them. What the evidence suggests is that Hecate became, from that moment forward, a companion to Persephone. Not a servant, not a subordinate. A companion, one who moved, as Persephone moved, between registers of the world, who was familiar with the dark and did not require rescue from it, who carried light not because the dark was to be feared, but because light was useful and the task required it. The ancient sources use the word attendant. Later scholars have revised this to companion, based on the symmetry of the relationship as it appears in subsequent texts. Hecate accompanied Persephone in both directions, down into the underworld in autumn, up into the world of the living in spring. She understood the passage. This bond is one of the details the records preserve with some consistency, even when other details vary or are lost. Demeter came across the Rarian plain. The accounts describe her movement as rapid. She had been waiting. The hymn suggests she had not moved freely across the earth during the months of winter, that her grief had kept her close and inward. Now she came across the field with an urgency that the ancient authors described with care, choosing words that conveyed force without disorder. She did not run. She moved at the pace of something that had been restrained for a long time and was no longer restrained. The reunion is described in the Homeric hymn in language that the ancient world clearly felt to be among the most moving available to it, mother and daughter. The earth responding, the grain beginning in that same moment to press upward through the loosened soil. The smell of it, the particular smell of grain in early growth, which the Greek sources associate with something close to the sacred. They stood together on the Rarian plain. The sky above them was pale. The grass was short and new. The Lethe ran far below in its channels beneath the dark world, carrying what it carried. The dead drifted in the asphodel meadows undisturbed. The bronze lamp in the dark hall burned without her presence to observe it. Above, on the plain, Demeter pressed both hands to her daughter's face. The ancient scholars who attempted to reconstruct this moment generally note its difficulty. The reunion was private. No mortal witness was present to record the spoken exchange, if any occurred. The hymn renders the moment and then moves forward into the practical negotiations about the terms of the divided year, into Demeter's restored attention to the grain, into the founding of the rites at Eleusis. What the hymn leaves, and what the scholars have largely left after it, is the precise quality of what passed between them on the plain. The Rarian grass was soft beneath Persephone's feet. She could feel its texture. She could feel the cool morning air. The sensation returned to the body readily, as though it had only been set aside rather than erased. The bright upper world, the open sky, the smell of soil and new grass, and the faint cold of early spring air. Hecate stood at a short distance. Her torches burned in the morning light, pale against the pale sky. Demeter lowered her hands after a time. She did not step back. She remained close. The accounts describe what followed in practical terms. Demeter turned toward the plain. She looked at the short new grass, the pale sky, the folded flowers still waiting in the cold. The earth had been still for a long time. The hymn suggests she understood in that moment what was needed. Not grief now, work. The ancient sources indicate that Demeter's return to her role was neither gradual nor reluctant. She had mourned completely. She had withdrawn completely. The restoration, when it came, was complete in the same way. She moved back into her domain the way water returns to a dry channel, without ceremony, without announcement. The ground received her attention, and the ground responded. What the records preserve from this period is largely agricultural, lists of places, names of towns where grain returned first, the particular fields of the Rarian plain identified in later texts as the site of the first new growth. Ancient sources describe this land as the oldest cultivated soil in the Greek world, the place where grain had been planted before any other. It was fitting, scholars have observed, that Demeter chose to begin here. Persephone stood beside her mother for a while. The records do not specify how long. Then Demeter moved. She walked out across the field. Her pace was steady, deliberate. The ancient descriptions suggest a figure entirely absorbed in the task ahead. She did not look back. Persephone watched her go. This detail, small and unremarked upon in most ancient accounts, appears in a secondary source. A scholar writing much later, drawing on materials that are now lost, notes that Persephone remained standing on the plain while her mother walked outward across the field, that she watched, that she did not follow immediately, but stood for a time in the morning light, with the grass cool and short beneath her feet. Hecate remained as well. Her torches still burned. The Homeric hymn moves quickly past this interval. It does not linger on Persephone's stillness. It turns instead to the practical proceedings, Demeter's instructions to the Eleusinians, the founding of the rites. The rites themselves held in a form so sacred that the ancient world agreed not to record their content. The hymn moves forward because the hymn was composed for specific purposes, not to document what Persephone felt standing on the Rarian plain, but to establish the sacred origins of ceremonies that would endure for centuries. What the hymn required, the hymn preserved. The rest has been reconstructed as best it can be. Demeter went first to Eleusis. The sources are consistent on this point. She returned to the temple the Eleusinians had built at her instruction, the one she had withdrawn into during the months of famine. She did not remain there long. She had work to do that required movement, required her presence in the fields and on the roads and in the long flat plains where grain needed to be called back into the soil. The founding of the rites at Eleusis appears in the Homeric hymn as a deliberate act. Demeter did not simply restore the earth. She also established what would be preserved. She taught the princes of Eleusis the sacred ceremonies. The accounts name several of them: Triptolemus, Diocles, Eumolpus, Celeus himself. She gave them the forms of the rites and the obligations that went with them. What those rites contained, the ancient sources declined to record. The Eleusinian mysteries were among the most widely observed ceremonies in the Greek world for nearly 1,000 years. Initiates came from across the Mediterranean. They made the journey. They observed the rites, and they kept the secret. No ancient writer who had been initiated recorded what occurred in the innermost ceremony. This silence is itself a form of evidence. It suggests that what was preserved there was considered too significant for ordinary record. Not dangerous exactly, but too particular, too precise. The scholars who study the mysteries note that what little can be recovered suggests a ceremony built around the story of Persephone, her descent, the grief of her mother, the return of the grain. The initiates, it appears, were brought through some version of that passage. The dark, the searching, the finding again. Not literally, but in a form that made it present, made it felt rather than simply known. Demeter taught the rites because she understood what they preserved. Not only the grain, not only the agricultural knowledge that her earlier gift to humanity had established, but the understanding that loss could be followed by return, that the earth went cold and came back, that what descended did not stay entirely below. The records are partial on the specific content of her instruction at Eleusis. They preserve the names of those who received it. They note the location. They describe the founding of the telesterion, the hall of initiation. They indicate that the ceremonies were held each year, in autumn, in the month that later sources called the month of Persephone's descent. Persephone, standing on the Rarian plain that morning, did not know all of what her mother would establish. The evidence suggests she remained on the plain while Demeter moved toward Eleusis, the short grass, the folded flowers only beginning to open in the pale light, the sky above unchanged, still that thin early colour that was not yet full. Hecate lowered her torches. The light of them had been pale against the morning already. Now she held them at her side. The flames continued, smaller against the growing light. The two of them stood in the open field, Persephone and Hecate. The plain extended around them, the Rarian soil dark and soft, the smell of it, wet earth and early grass, and somewhere below, far below, the faint imagined sound of moving water in channels deep beneath the world, the Lethe in its long course. It did not reach here. It did not surface. It ran where it ran, below the dark meadows, below the stone passages, below the place where the hall stood empty of her. But Persephone had stood beside it often enough. She knew its sound. She knew the quality of silence that surrounded it. Here, on the plain, the silence was different. It had wind in it, the small movement of new grass, the distant sound of birds returning to the fields. She had not heard birds in a long time. Hecate stood beside her without speaking. This is consistent with what the sources describe of Hecate's general bearing in the mythological record. She was not a figure given to unnecessary speech. She carried her torches. She walked beside. She understood the nature of thresholds and did not require those thresholds to be explained. Persephone listened to the birds. The flowers at her feet were still closed. They would open later. The sun was still low. The air was still cool. Everything on the plain was at the very beginning of itself, not yet arrived, not yet complete, but present, here, in the thin, pale morning light. Her mother was somewhere across the field, already walking toward the work she had deferred for so long. The grain was beginning to move below the soil. The ancient sources describe it metaphorically, but the agricultural reality they point to is clear enough. The seeds had been there through the cold months, waiting, not lost, only waiting. And now the soil was warm enough, barely, and the instruction had been given, and the long, slow process of return had started in the dark beneath the surface, where no one could see it yet. Persephone looked out across the plain. Hecate stood beside her, holding her torches in the pale morning. The morning continued to grow around her. Persephone did not move from the place where she stood. The Rarian plain extended in all directions, pale sky, dark soil, the small sound of wind moving through grass that was only beginning to be grass again. She had not thought in the cold halls of the underworld that the earth would feel like this, so particular, so specific in its texture and smell, the cold of the soil through the soles of her feet, the way the light came from a low angle and made even short grass cast shadows. The birds continued somewhere across the field, distant, returning. This was the morning after. The sources are careful to note that Persephone's return did not immediately restore everything. The earth came back slowly. The grain moved below the surface in its own time. The flowers opened over days, not hours. Whatever Demeter had withdrawn was given back gradually in the patient way that growing things require. Persephone understood this. She had learned in the months below that certain things cannot be hurried. What the ancient accounts do not record clearly is how long she stood on the plain that first morning. The texts describe the reunion. They describe Demeter's joy. They describe the restoration of the grain. But the quiet time that followed, the time of simply standing in the returning light, is largely absent from the record. What survives suggests only that she was there, that the morning passed, that Hecate remained beside her. The day would deepen. She knew this. She also knew what the deepening of days eventually meant. This is what the sources identify as the particular difficulty of Persephone's condition. Not the descent itself, which had been violent and involuntary and from which she had returned, but the knowing, the understanding that autumn would come, that the terms of her return were also the terms of her departure, that every morning she stood in the upper air was a morning closer to the next descent. The pomegranate seeds had established this. 3 seeds, or 4, depending on the source consulted. The scholars who have examined the textual tradition at length note that the precise number is less significant than the fact. She had eaten. She was bound. Not entirely to one world or the other, to both. In sequence, without end. Hecate lowered her torches further. The flames had diminished. The morning light was stronger now, and the torches, which had been necessary in the dark and in the grey, were becoming unnecessary. They still burned. They simply no longer provided anything that the growing day did not already provide. Persephone looked at them. The small flames. She had followed those torches down once. In the early grey of her first day back in the upper air, Hecate had walked beside her from the place of ascent to the Rarian plain, the torches ahead, the dark still behind. She had not looked back. The sources note this specifically. She had not turned to look at the path she had come up. Now the torches were burning lower, not extinguished, still present, but receding. This is consistent with what the mythological record preserves about Hecate's role in the cycle. She was present at both passages. She heard the cries at the abduction. She walked beside Persephone at the return. Later accounts confirm she would walk beside her again at each subsequent descent, each spring's end, each autumn's beginning. The threshold was Hecate's domain, and the passage between the worlds was a threshold that occurred again and again. There was no record, in any ancient source, of what Persephone felt when she first understood that the return was not permanent. The Homeric hymn describes the reunion fully. It describes Demeter's relief, her swift return to her duties, the immediate restoration of the grain. It does not dwell on what Persephone knew in the quiet after. The scholarly reconstruction must work carefully here. From what is preserved, what can be inferred, she had stood in the underworld palace and learned to govern. She had sat in the great hall and heard petitions. She had understood the Lethe's sound and the silence around it, that particular absence of urgency that characterized the place below. She had come to know Hades' kingdom not as a stranger passing through, but as a ruler who had grown into her authority there, and she had also stood this morning and heard birds. Both things were true. The sources do not resolve this. The mythological tradition does not offer a simple account of Persephone's inner experience, because the tradition was not primarily interested in her experience. It was interested in the grain, in the seasons, in the theological explanation for winter. But the figure in the record, the one who stood on the Rarian plain while her mother walked toward Eleusis, suggests something more precise than a symbol. She had eaten the seeds. She had not been forced to eat them. The sources on this point are not unanimous, but the majority accounts suggest she knew what she was doing, or knew enough, knew that eating in the realm of the dead created an obligation, knew that the obligation would bind her. The autumn would come. It always came. Even now, with the morning growing and the birds returning and the grain beginning its slow work below the dark soil, even now the autumn was already implicit, already present in the logic of the terms. Hecate said nothing. This is consistent. The sources never record Hecate offering comfort in the conventional sense. She walked beside. She held her torches. She understood the nature of what she accompanied without requiring it to be otherwise. Persephone stood on the Rarian soil and let the morning come. The flowers at her feet were opening, very slowly, pale still, the petals barely parted. The light had not yet reached them fully. They were responding to what was there, not yet to what would be there when the sun was higher. Below her, somewhere in the long dark channels beneath the world, the Lethe ran in its course. It did not reach here. It ran where it ran. She knew its sound. She had stood beside it many times, and she had never let it touch her. This the sources confirm in a different register, through the nature of her authority below. She had retained herself, she had descended and governed, and was now standing on the oldest soil in the world, listening to birds, with her mother's back growing small across the plain. She would go to her mother. The evidence suggests this happened later in the day. The morning first, the plain, the returning light. She bent once and touched the soil, the dark Rarian earth, wet and cool and particular, the oldest cultivated ground, the first place grain had ever grown. She held a small amount of it briefly in her palm. Then she straightened. The plain extended. The birds continued across the field, somewhere she could not yet see. The flames of Hecate's torches burned smaller in the growing light, and the sky above the Rarian plain moved, very slowly, from pale toward the colour of a full morning. The palace of Hades has no windows. This is noted in the earliest accounts, not as a deprivation, but as a fact of architecture. The underworld has no sun to admit, no sky to frame. The great hall where Persephone sits is lit by something else. The sources describe a diffuse illumination, cold and consistent, that comes from no single point. She sits on her throne now. The autumn has come, as it was always going to come. The hall is quiet. It has its own particular quality of silence, different from the silence of the Rarian plain this morning, different from the silence she remembered from the meadow before any of this began. The underworld's silence contains the presence of many souls moving at their own slow pace through the asphodel meadows below. It is never truly empty of inhabitants. It is simply still, the way deep water is still even when it moves. Persephone's throne is set beside Hades' own. Both face the long hall. The columns are dark stone, polished smooth. The floor is the same. Everything in this palace has been made with precision and without warmth, and she has learned to read its particular beauty. The way a scholar learns to read a language that has no soft consonants. Across her knee rests a single asphodel blossom. She brought it down from the world above. This detail does not appear in the Homeric hymn, which ends before the descent. It is not in Ovid, nor in Claudian's elaborate account, but the logic of the myth allows for it. She had been standing on the Rarian plain. There had been flowers at her feet, opening slowly in the early light. Pale petals barely parted. She had taken one before she descended, held it through the passage. It rests on her knee now, and it has not wilted. Asphodel does not wilt easily. The plant grows in both worlds, and the blossom seems to understand this, or at least to persist in a way that suggests it is not confused by the transition. The rivers can be heard from here, not loudly, not intrusively, a sound like the movement of something very old through stone channels far below the floor. The Styx runs deepest. The Acheron moves through its own course. The Lethe is the quietest of them, and its quiet is a specific kind, the sound of forgetting made into water, made into current, made into the thing that receives souls and removes from them the particular weight of having lived. Persephone knows its sound. She has stood beside it many times. She has never let it touch her. The souls come to it and are received by it, and emerge from it lighter, emptied of the specific grief of particularity. And she has watched this with the attention of someone who governs a process she does not share. She retains everything. This is part of what makes her authority in this place genuine rather than ceremonial. She remembers the meadow, she remembers the narcissus among the other flowers, white and strange and pulling the eye away from the crocuses and the violets. She remembers Hecate's torches on the Rarian plain this morning, still burning but diminishing in the growing light. She remembers the soil in her palm, dark and cool and wet, and the smell of it, the particular richness of the oldest cultivated ground. She brings all of it down with her, each time. There is a scholar's argument, reconstructed from various late classical sources, that this is precisely what the myth requires her to do. The underworld needs a queen who has not forgotten what the upper world contains. The souls who come to her in petition, Orpheus standing in the hall with his lyre, still warm from playing, Psyche arriving exhausted from her tasks, Heracles in his lion skin making the stones feel briefly less cold. They come to her because she can hear them as someone who understands what it is they have lost. She can hear them because she has not forgotten, because she chose to retain. The asphodel blossom on her knee is pale against the dark fabric of her robe. It is a small thing, specific. It came from a field that was just beginning to open when she left it, the petals barely parted, the light not yet high enough to bring them fully out. By now, the morning on the Rarian plain will have advanced. Demeter will have reached Eleusis. The grain will be continuing its slow work below the dark soil. Hecate's torches, no longer needed in the full morning light, may have been extinguished or carried elsewhere. The birds that were distant and heard but not seen will have moved through the field in their own directions. All of this is continuing. Above, Persephone holds this knowledge the way she held the soil this morning. Briefly, without trying to keep it beyond its time. The hall is quiet. The rivers sound below. A single lamp burns at the far end of the hall, set into the wall, casting a low and steady light across the polished floor. She does not need to govern this moment. No petitions are being heard. No souls are waiting at the threshold. The great hall is simply itself, dark and precise and ancient, and she is simply here in it, as she will be for the months ahead, until the terms of the agreement turn and the passage opens again and Hecate comes with her torches to walk beside her. Persephone rests one hand along the arm of the throne. The stone is cool under her fingers. She is still. The blossom is pale across her knee, and the lamp at the far end of the hall burns without flickering in the airless dark, and somewhere below the floor the Lethe moves through its course, quiet and purposeful and entirely unhurried, carrying the souls of the world toward the particular mercy of forgetting.